All right, so let's dig into the kiddos and their diets, okay? I love this question. I love this question because the answer is kind of harsh, and I'll try to make the answer not harsh. But here's the question. How do we know our children are getting the proper macros? I have a 2 and a 4-year-old. And the answer to this is you don't. You straight up don't. And you will not unless you come to me. And I understand that that sounds pompous or that sounds arrogant or whatever, but I'm telling you, I talked about this when I was on the Optimized Paleo podcast. So if you guys didn't see that, I was on the Optimized Paleo podcast with Autumn Smith from Paleo Valley, and she talked to me all about my program called Clovis Kids. So I started this program called Clovis Kids because I realized that if you were to walk down the street and ask 100 parents the daily nutrient and caloric intake needs and macronutrient needs of their child, 100 of them would not know. Literally that bad. If you were to walk down the street and ask 100 parents, I'm virtually certain that 100 of them would not know the correct answer to that question. I'm saying all of them. It's really that bad. But why? Because if you try to research this, you're going to find zero details, no nuance whatsoever. So if you're looking at like the conventional medical community, which is where all parents get their advice on children from, which drives me fucking crazy, is it'll say things like, if it's a child age 2 to 3 years old, it needs 1,000 to 1,400 calories depending on activity level. Or if it's like a male that's 4 to 8 years old, he needs 1,400 to 2,000 calories a day. Or if it's a female between the ages of 14 and 18 years old, she needs anywhere from 1,800 to 24 calories a day. They just give you these ballpark figures. Now, this is directly from the medical community. Those kinds of figures actually come from the Institute of Medicine, their dietary guidelines. So what happens is these are the numbers that doctors are going off of. And you are going to be hard pressed to find a conventional medicine doctor who will even mention macronutrient ratios or understand what macronutrient ratios are. It's just like, oh, your kid needs 2,000 calories. Make them eat 2,000 calories. Your kid's small, make them eat 2,000 calories. So then you get these poor moms that are like, oh my God, my kid needs 2,000 calories. And what's the best way to get a kid to eat 2,000 calories? Because I promise you, your kid's not going to eat 2,000 calories of ribeye steak, right? So the easiest way to get a kid to eat a ton of food is hyperpalatable foods, refined processed carbohydrates. And boom, the kid grows, but the kid grows horizontally instead of vertically. The next thing you know, you got a kid who's obese with chronic disease because your dummy doctor told you that your kid needs to eat 2,000 calories and he doesn't care where you get them from. So load up on the Pop-Tarts and the Cheetos, everybody, right? So what I did was I went out into the world and I created my own algorithm. And as far as I know, it's the only one that exists. I think it's still the only one that exists. And it was very difficult to create. I literally think I have the first one in the world. Now, this is within Clovis Kids. So if anybody's purchased Clovis Kids, they know what I'm talking about. But I have a macronutrient calculator for kids that will give them caloric intake, fat, protein, and net carbohydrates. So I explained this on Autumn's podcast, the Optimized Paleo podcast, that I literally had to scour PubMed and Google Scholar, and I had to look for the caloric needs of children. And I kept coming up empty, nothing besides these bullshit reference ranges. So I literally had to piece together multiple different studies using different basal metabolic rate calculations, BMR calculations. So I pieced together all the studies of BMR calculation methods. Then I compared them versus something called indirect calorimetry. So indirect calorimetry actually tracks gas exchange measurements on resting patients. You're basically in a bubble, right? So they're measuring carbon dioxide production and oxygen consumption at rest. So they'll also test this during like steady state exercise, right? So this will give you like a 24-hour caloric requirement based on what's called resting energy expenditure. You guys have heard me talk about basal metabolic rate. RMR and BMR are often just used interchangeably, even though the two tests are a little bit different, but that's super nerdy. We won't get into that, right? So I examined all of the biggest players in the game in terms of clinical data, which is like the Harris-Benedict equation, the Schofield equation, the Mifflin-St. Jeor equation, the World Health Organization equation versus indirect calorimetry. So I go through all this stuff to find all these studies to find that in adults, the Mifflin-St. Jeor seems to be the most accurate. But for kids, particularly for obese kids, which we live in a world now where 20% of kids are obese, then the World Health Organization's calculation was the most accurate when compared to indirect calorimetry, which is the most accurate, right? So then I have to dig back into my textbooks. I actually went into a book called Advanced Nutrition and Human Metabolism, 5th edition, everybody. And that was from my specialist in sports nutrition studies. And I had to find energy multipliers for these kids. But then I have to take into consideration that virtually all kids are sedentary. Like the average kid in America has 6 hours of screen time outside of television, which means they're on like an iPad or a phone or something like that. It's just staggering, right? In school, they're on screens, they're sitting down all the time. So an average kid, even if they run around for an hour or two, that's still 22 other hours that they're completely sedentary. So most kids are sedentary. So then I got to think about the energy multipliers in terms of the population. So anyway, this is how I created the Clovis Kids calculator. And as far as I know, it's the only one in the world, and it's ridiculously accurate, okay? Incredibly accurate. So the answer to the question is, how do you know if your kid's getting proper macros? You really don't, unless you have something like this algorithm that I've created. And what comes up with parents is they're like, you're telling me my kid needs so much food. Like parents are shocked by the amount of food that their kids need, because in their head, they're thinking about it as like, well, I'm an adult and I need X amount of food. Therefore, my kids who are way smaller than me need Y amount of food. And that's probably like half the amount of food that I eat. This is how most people think. They're just like this. I'm a big human. That's a little human. I'm just going to feed them less. That's all cool, right? But you have to remember, adults are done growing. So like, unless you're a bodybuilder, you're not trying to get bigger unless you're a bodybuilder, right? And how do bodybuilders get bigger? They eat a ton of food. Kids are still growing new tissues. They're growing new brain matter. Literally, it's so important. New bones, new skeletal muscle, new organs, new brain matter, new tissue everywhere. Most adults are underfed and malnourished as it is, right? I've never had an adult client come to me looking to lose fat who was like genuinely just eating too much. It's usually like a malnourished problem or a hormone imbalance, right? It's because of this ridiculous war on calories that we have. So people just do not understand what their kids need nutritionally. Again, I don't think that that's an exaggeration to say, like, if you walk down, if I went down the streets of Nashville and just asked parents, 100 parents, what are the calories that your kid needs each day and at what macronutrient ratios? 100 of those 100 parents are going to say, I have no fucking idea what you're talking about, dude. And that's crazy, because then I get in these debates where people are like, you're not a parent, you don't get it, you don't know. And I'm like, I actually know quite a bit more about what your kid needs. I'm just saying, like, I actually understand this at a very deep level. I've researched it and built a fucking calculator. Do you want to have a conversation about this? Or do you want to just tell me how I don't understand because I don't have a kiddo, right? Or do you want to let me help you help your kid? You know, it's a big deal, man. This childhood nutrition is just everything to me. You guys know.